Now we'll see that the next section of the paper is talking about data collection. This is their methods. And we typically just skip this, skip the methods, because we know for two reasons. First, it is the least read section of an IMRAD report, which is a good reason to not prioritize it. Secondly, the methods section tends to be relatively easy to write. It's more factual accounting of what was done. There are fewer rhetorical decisions that writers struggle with. So that's a second reason that we generally skip these over. And then what I prefer to do is to go to the results section and read this like a scientist would. Read it looking at the figures and seeing if we can understand the main stories in here. Now we focus on figures and not tables because a figure is sort of an indication, it's a promise that this result is important to the writer. And we know it's important because they took the time, space, and ink to visualize it, as opposed to putting it in a table where things are much more compact and condensed. So we focus on the figures and making sure that we can understand them and understand the stories that they tell. Now in this case, right here, this figure is relatively easy to understand. Reading both the caption and the visualization, it's pretty easy to see that business has the most passwords guessed, and I believe that this is the Tepper School of Business and not Heinz, so those of you who are in Heinz can kind of breathe a sigh of relief here. So business had the most password guessed and computer science had the least. Now if I was unsure about this or if it was muddy or unclear, I could do a quick search and just search for figure 1 in the text here. So I have figure 1 illustrates the relationships, and it explains that these 3 disciplines are associated with stronger passwords, and these are the weaker ones. And that's certainly what the figure shows. There is a sort of a contract. Every time that we have a figure, it must be referred to in the text. It must be explained in the text. The basic rule or principle here is that we could take the figures out and just read the text and still get the main points, that they could work independently of one another. So we need to make sure both the figure and the text tells the story of the data. Now we can continue looking at additional figures. Figure 2, this seems pretty intuitive what is being discussed here. Figure 3 is the first one where I've had a little bit of difficulty reading this. And if you had some difficulty with it, I think you're in good company. So this is one where we might want to look at the text. Now before I do it, one thing I want to point out here is that the caption is several sentences long. I like this. This is really good so that we can get a lot of information. And so they include this, for example, so that we get some advice on how to read this. The trend in most disciplines is moving towards longer captions that contain more of the story of the figure. But not all disciplines are there, not all writers are there, and sometimes they will say their caption needs to look more like this. So let the writer make that decision, but go ahead and say that GCC's general preference is to include more information. It's more reader friendly here. So if I search for figure 3 in the text here and look at this whole paragraph, it does a pretty good job orienting me to what the writer's main points are. That password composition is strongly correlated with password strength. increasing the number of characters of any type has stronger passwords, and as we add things, we're making the password less likely to be guessed. So this helps us understand the figure a little bit more. But one thing that I note as I'm looking at this figure is that each of these y-axes is different, and this makes it kind of hard to draw comparisons across these. So for instance, we can't really tell from looking at the figures whether adding uppercase is better or not than digits. So something that I would suggest to the writer is finding a way to make all of these have the same scale on the axes, because this is something that makes it even more complicated. Now, as I continue to look in different sections, the figures that the writers include are very easy to interpret, to understand. Labeling these right here really helps us understand the main story. When you're working with a writer, what can be very effective in a session is just to say your understanding. So I would say, all right, looking at this figure, what I'm guessing is that if the user finds the password annoying to create, that it's easier to guess than if they find it not annoying. And then the writer can confirm, yes, you got it. Or if that's not their point, if their point was possibly the opposite of that, then we need to work together to figure out how to change it. So just by repeating back what your understanding is, you can, and confirming that with the writer, can be very, very helpful to them in a session. If the figure itself is a little bit more confusing, as for instance, when we get to these figures down here, then, and this is more confusing, I think, just because it's a more confusing point, then we look to the text and make sure that the text really conveys the story. And in the text, we expect sort of the broadest point first with a good topic sentence, and then narrowing down to more sort of fine-grained points about these. So you can go ahead and search for figure 6 in the text and see, does this make sense? Now, when I search for figure 6 in the text here, I am a little bit confused. Actually, all of this here under the online studies, I think, goes with figure 6, but because it has a separate heading, that's a little unclear. So I would point that out to the writer, that I had this little bit of confusion, but I think that it does a good job. Once I realized that this is explaining figure 6, it does a pretty good job of explaining it. So when I'm working with an IMRAD report, what I typically do is we start with the abstract. Is that clear? Then move to the introduction. Is that clear? Then look at the results and really looking for, do we understand what the figures are telling? If not, can we figure it out from the text? Does the text do a good job explaining it? Sometimes the story is just hard to understand because it's complicated. Then after I go through the figures and make sure that we get the writer's main results, we move to the discussion. So let's look at the discussion in this article. The discussion section here is actually called conclusions. That's fine. It can go under different names. I don't even mention that. Conclusion is fine. And so how do they structure this? They begin this section by kind of an overview of what the future implications are. And the goal of a discussion section should be moving to understanding the current study and putting it in context with what prior research has done, to actions for the future, either practical steps that could be taken for practitioners or future directions for research. So in the first paragraph here, they move us to sort of summarizing what what they're going to talk about. Then, next paragraph, we move into discussing the main focus of the findings, Some elements of the university population create more vulnerable passwords than others. That was a key thing. It was mentioned in the abstract. It was mentioned in the very first figure, and it's mentioned first among the findings in the discussion section. And then they go into a little more detail, and then they hypothesize why this might be the case. So kind of elaborating, going a little bit more on a limb about what their findings mean. Then they discuss another finding and contextualize it with prior work, using things like in line with prior work, or we also confirm that these things exist. And then in this next paragraph, they talk about another finding and then say what the future implications are. So these 3 paragraphs right here are all taking their findings, putting them in context, explaining a little bit more what these findings mean. In the next paragraph, we start to talk about limitations. It is important to note that it's under CMU's policy, and our analysis does not allow us to draw conclusions about the various requirements. Usually there's more discussion of limitations than this article has, but the reason why is because honestly the methodology for this article is really pretty sound, and they really did a lot of work to get these high value passwords. So they do talk about some of the limitations here, and then they move into implications. How people who are in charge of security for an organization, what kinds of guidelines, restrictions, requirements might they put on password generation. So these are the implications for this audience. And then they move to discussing about implications for future researchers. Notice that how the language is moving to future tense. Everything is moving towards the future here. Now what they've done for these last couple paragraphs, they're defining a specific audience here and saying what their findings mean for these audiences and how they can apply it. People who are working with mTurk, which is kind of a common it's a common thing in computer studies. And so they explain their implications here and explain what they mean. So the overall focus of the discussion section moves from what are the most important findings and what do they mean to what are the directions for future research and for future applications. These are the sections. These are the ways that we typically work with an IMRAD report in a GCC section, focusing on these areas first, unless the student comes in specifically saying, I want to work on the methods, or I want to work on this part of the results section.